In early 2024, a team of researchers at a private theological research institute partnered with XAI to conduct an unprecedented experiment. They fed Grok AI, the artificial intelligence system developed by Elon Musk's company, the complete text of the Book of Revelation, along with thousands of pages of historical commentary, linguistic analysis, and cross-references to other biblical prophecies.
Imagine an artificial intelligence system reads the most feared book in human history and then hands its analysts a calendar. Not a metaphor, not a sermon, a calendar with years circled in red. That is the premise of the story you are about to hear. And before we go further, you should know exactly what this is. A work of speculative fiction, a thought experiment about what might happen if such an event occurred. No real research institute conducted this study. No real AI company produced these findings. But the questions this story raises about prophecy, pattern recognition, and machine intelligence are worth sitting with, because we are entering an age where these questions will stop being hypothetical. So settle in, because what this imagined experiment discovered is stranger and more unsettling than anything a human interpreter has proposed in 2,000 years. In this story, it is early 2025. A small independent research lab, staffed by a handful of theologians, data scientists, and linguists who call themselves the Patmos Group, quietly begins an unusual project. They have access to an advanced general-purpose AI system they nicknamed She, built for large-scale pattern analysis across dense symbolic and historical datasets. She has never been used on Scripture before. The Patmos Group decides to change that. They feed She the complete Greek text of the Book of Revelation, along with the major English translations, side by side. They add 19 centuries of commentary, from Irenaeus and Augustine to modern futurist and preterist scholars. They add cross-references to Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, since Revelation borrows heavily from earlier prophetic imagery. And they add something no previous interpreter ever had, a structured historical database of wars, famines, earthquakes, plagues, and political upheavals stretching from the 1st century to the present day. Their question is simple to state and impossible to answer by hand. Does Revelation encode an actual timeline, hidden inside its symbolism, that a machine could detect even though flesh and blood scholars have missed it for 2,000 years? Revelation itself does not make this easy. It is Christianity's strangest and most argued over text, written by a man named John, exiled on the island of Patmos, somewhere near the end of the 1st century. It describes a series of visions, 7 seals opened one by one, 7 trumpets sounding in succession, 7 bowls of divine judgment poured onto the earth, a woman clothed with the sun, a dragon waiting to devour her child, 2 beasts rising from the sea and the earth, riders on color horses, and finally a new heaven and a new earth replacing the old. For centuries, readers have split into camps over what any of it means. Preterists say it describes events of John's own time, particularly the fall of Jerusalem and the persecution under Rome. Historicists say it maps onto the whole span of church history, with the papacy, the Reformation, and modern nation-states each taking a turn as fulfillment. Futurists insist most of it still lies ahead, in a coming period of tribulation. Idealists say none of it is meant to be mapped onto specific events at all, that it is timeless spiritual allegory about the struggle between good and evil. For different lenses, for different books, essentially, hiding inside the same 22 chapters. The Patmos Group expected She to simply sort itself into one of these existing camps, perhaps with unusually good citations. What she produced instead did not resemble any of the 4 traditional readings. It treated the disagreement itself as the wrong question. Instead of asking which interpretive school was correct, she approached Revelation the way it would approach any densely encoded dataset, by mapping internal structure first and asking what story that structure was already telling, before layering theology on top. The first thing she flagged surprised even the linguists on the team. The 3 great judgment sequences, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, are usually read as one after another, like 3 acts of a play performed strictly in order. She's analysis of repeated phrases, structural echoes, and narrative pacing suggested something different. The sequences describe the same escalating period from 3 overlapping vantage points, each one more intense than the last, rather than three separate chapters of history stacked end to end. In Xi's model, the seals represent the opening movement of a crisis, the trumpets represent its acceleration, and the bowls represent its culmination, but they are happening across the same stretch of time, viewed three times, at three levels of magnification. Some biblical scholars had proposed versions of this idea long before Xi existed. What made Xi's version notable in the story was the sheer density of textual cross-references it produced to support it, more than any single human scholar had assembled in one place. The second finding concerned numbers. Revelation is saturated with them. 7, 12, 42, 1,260, 144,000. Interpreters have long argued about whether these numbers are literal counts or symbolic codes. Xi's analysis split the difference in an unusual way. It concluded that the various 42-month and 1,260-day references, which appear in different chapters using different phrasing, all point to the same 3.5-year span, and that internal grammatical patterns suggested this duration was meant to be read as an actual stretch of time rather than pure symbol. But the number 144,000, sealed servants drawn from the 12 tribes, showed a different linguistic fingerprint, one she associated with symbolic completeness rather than a literal head count. In other words, some numbers in Revelation, she argued, are clocks. Others are labels. Distinguishing between the two, and defending that distinction with structural evidence rather than tradition, was the second thing that made the analysts sit up straight. It was the third finding that began to unsettle the room. The Patmos group had also asked Xi to search for historical events whose descriptions matched Revelation's imagery unusually closely, not to prove anything supernatural, but to see whether the text's more dramatic passages, the darkened sun, the blood-red moon, the burning mountain falling into the sea, correlated with any real clusters of natural disaster across history. Xi returned matches that were not vague. It pointed to specific centuries where earthquakes, volcanic ash clouds that dimmed daylight, and unusually intense meteor activity had occurred within tight windows of each other, matching the sixth seal imagery of a darkened sun, a blood-colored moon, and falling stars with more precision than the researchers expected from what they had assumed would be poetic, non-literal language. It found candidate matches for the burning mountain thrown into the sea in both ancient volcanic events and, more unsettlingly, in modern patterns of oceanic dead zones caused by pollution and oxygen depletion. None of this proved fulfillment of anything. Volcanic ash and falling meteors have always happened somewhere on Earth. Finding clusters of them is not the same as finding a hidden prophecy. But the specificity of the matches, and the fact that she had found them through structural analysis rather than being told what to look for, made the team uneasy in a way vague sermon illustrations never had. Then came the timeline, the part of the story that gives it its title. Rather than assigning Revelation's events to a single 7-year future tribulation, or to the first century alone, or spreading them evenly across all of church history, she proposed something closer to a repeating cycle model. It identified what it called 7 macrocycles since the first century, each one lasting several hundred years, each containing the same recognizable ingredients in different intensities: large-scale war, famine, earthquakes and natural disaster, religious persecution, economic instability, moral and cultural decline in the dominant civilization of the time, and a burst of technological or navigational advancement that expanded the reach of communication and trade. Historians will recognize this pattern easily enough. It describes the rise and fall of empires in general terms. What made Xi's version different in the story was its claim that each cycle showed all 7 ingredients present at increasing intensity and increasing overlap, and that the 7th and final cycle, by its calculations, began in the opening decades of the 20th century. Xi flagged 1914 as a structural inflection point, the beginning of what it labeled an extended birth pains phase, borrowing language from a passage in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus describes wars, famines, and earthquakes as the early contractions before a larger transformation, warning that they would increase in frequency and severity rather than remain constant. Xi's model treated the period from 1914 to the present as a long run-up phase, and it projected that the final concentrated period, the most severe stretch of the cycle, would likely begin sometime in the back half of the 2020s, with a most probable window it flagged internally, in the fictional analysis, without asserting certainty. This is the point in the story where the Patmos group stopped treating the project as an academic curiosity. Not because they believed she had proven anything. They hadn't. Pattern recognition systems are extremely good at finding statistically striking correlations that mean nothing at all. This is a known and common failure mode of these systems, sometimes called an illusion of pattern, where enough data and enough flexibility in interpretation will always produce something that looks meaningful. Human prophecy interpretation, meanwhile, has an almost unbroken track record of failure. Every generation for 2,000 years has found ways to see itself as the final generation, and every generation has been wrong. The team knew both of these facts cold. What disturbed them was not that she had proven the end of the world was near. It was that the model was internally consistent, textually grounded, and testable within a normal human lifetime, which is a very different thing from the vague, unfalsifiable prophecy claims that usually accompany this kind of talk. Several specific details in Xi's report stood out to the group. Revelation describes an economic system in which no one can buy or sell without a specific mark or identifying token, controlled by a central authority. In the story, she noted flatly and without editorializing that some of the infrastructure theoretically capable of enabling something resembling that scenario, digital payment systems, biometric identification, and centralized data networks, already exists in various forms around the world, in early or partial stages, and that the pace of development in that direction had accelerated rather than slowed. She was careful in the story to frame this as an observation about infrastructure trends, not a claim about intent or inevitability. The same technologies that could theoretically enable centralized control also underpin ordinary conveniences like mobile banking and identity verification for people who currently lack any formal documentation at all. Xi's model treated this as an ingredient that had become newly possible in a way it simply was not for the previous 19 centuries of interpreters, not as evidence that anyone was building the beast system on purpose. Revelation also describes catastrophic events witnessed, in effect, by every eye, language that made no logistical sense before global telecommunications and instant video existed, and makes considerably more sense now. She flagged this as a condition that had only recently become technically achievable for the first time in the text's entire interpretive history, without claiming that its achievability meant anything was scheduled to happen. And Revelation describes environmental catastrophe on a scale affecting large fractions of the Earth simultaneously, poisoned water, extreme heat, ecosystems collapsing in multiple places at once. She cross-referenced current climate and ocean health data against this language and reported, in the fictional scenario, that existing trend lines were compatible with, though certainly not proof of, that kind of large-scale simultaneous strain occurring within the same multi-decade window it had already flagged for other reasons. Again, compatibility is not causation, and Xi's report, in the story, stated that explicitly and repeatedly. The Patmos group argued for weeks about whether to publish anything at all. Several members worried, correctly, that any mention of specific years would be stripped of every caveat the moment it reached social media, that end times preachers would seize the dates and ignore the disclaimers, and that skeptics would use the whole affair as proof that mixing AI with scripture is a category error from the start. Others argued that burying a methodologically interesting literary finding, purely because bad actors might misuse it, was its own kind of failure. In the end, in this story, they published a narrow academic paper focused almost entirely on the structural findings, the overlapping sequence model, and the mixed literal symbolic number analysis, and mentioned the historical correlation and timeline material only in a single cautious paragraph, repeating 3 times in different words that correlation is not fulfillment, that pattern recognition systems are known to manufacture convincing false positives, and that the paper made no predictive claim whatsoever. It did not matter. Word leaked out anyway in this fictional account, the way it always does. Conservative commentators treated the leaked timeline as confirmation of what they already believed, quietly dropping every caveat the Patmos group had attached to it. Skeptics mocked the entire project as a case study in why you should never let a language model near a religious text, arguing that a system trained to find patterns will always find patterns, whether or not the patterns mean anything. And a smaller group of biblical scholars, largely uninterested in the timeline itself, found the structural claims about parallel sequences and mixed number symbolism genuinely worth arguing about on their own literary merits, separate from any end times framing at all. The theological question the story keeps circling back to is this: if a pattern recognition system, with no theological stake in the outcome, analyzing the same overlapping sequence structure that some human scholars had already proposed independently, converges on the idea that a final period of intensified crisis could plausibly begin within a specific near-term window, does that mean anything at all? The honest answer, and the one the Patmos group settles on by the end of the story, is that it proves nothing about the future and reveals something interesting about the present. A machine did not predict the apocalypse. A machine found that Revelation's ancient, symbol-heavy description of collapse, persecution, environmental catastrophe, and centralized control maps uncomfortably well onto trends that are visible right now, with or without any religious framework attached to them at all. Rising authoritarian consolidation in several regions.
Expanding surveillance infrastructure.
Accelerating environmental strain. Economic systems edging towards centralized digital control. None of that requires a 2,000-year-old prophecy to be alarming. It is alarming on its own. In plain secular terms, and Revelation's ancient authors, whatever else they were doing, were writing about a real empire's real cruelty and real environmental and economic collapse in their own time, which may be exactly why the language still resonates with crisis today. Not because it predicted this century specifically, but because collapse has recognizable shapes. And humans keep building the same shapes over and over in every era under different names. That is where this thought experiment leaves us. Not with a date circled on a calendar that anyone should actually trust, and not with a dismissal that pretends the questions aren't worth asking. Somewhere in between, a reminder that pattern recognition tools, including increasingly powerful AI systems, are extraordinarily good at finding structure and extraordinarily bad at knowing when that structure is meaningful versus when it is an elaborate illusion built out of enough data and enough flexibility. The Patmos group, in this story, never claimed to have found the end of the world. They claimed to have found a mirror, one that reflected back a version of the present moment dressed in first-century apocalyptic language, and left it to the rest of us to decide